Hello everyone, and welcome to part 2 of accessing databases from Yi 2. I left this part to include the ActiveRecord information, and that's just because ActiveRecord is really the richest of the ways in which you interact with the database. And you've already used ActiveRecord because that's what happens automatically when you create your model classes. So if we go to Yi, done it wrong again. I found out the reason it didn't work yesterday is because I had debug disabled in my code. Anyway, if we use these model generators, which you've seen before, you type in a table name like book, it decides on a class name, you set the namespace, everything else, and hit preview. Now, I obviously already have a book class, so that shows that if I want to generate this, then I'm going to overwrite it, which I'm not going to do. But one of the things, a little trick, I'm not sure if you've seen this before, is if you click this button here, it will actually show you any changes that would be made. And in this case, it will show you the class it would generate. And what sometimes that's really useful for is you can kind of copy stuff out of that and paste it into your model in NetBeans in here if you want, paste it in directly. So that can be quite handy. But what happens when you create these in Yi for models is you actually create an ActiveRecord class. And what that ActiveRecord really is it's a pattern. So again, this is not Yi specific, but it's a way of encapsulating a database table into a code class. So we've already seen our book class here. We see that it extends ActiveRecord, and what this means is automatically these column names will be pulled into properties, which you can get and set as you've already done. The only thing it sets here is the table name, and then on top of that, if you want, you can add rules and attribute labels. But other than that, basically there isn't very much code here, but automatically, as we've seen in some of our views, without writing hardly any code, if we look at, say, the book one, and we look at, say, a view, which actually uses the form, you see here that all we do is we get the model, which in this case we've said is a book, and we just get the title out. And that title happens to be a database column, which we can see in here if we're interested. It happens to be this column here. But without actually writing any SQL code at all of this just wires up automatically. And that's really the power of ActiveRecord. It's very, very simple. And Yi 2, like most frameworks, hides most of the details of how that works. So we're going to ignore that side of things because that's all hidden away. We've already used it, and in some ways we're not really too bothered about that when we're just learning Yi 2. We just want to learn how to use maybe some of the more useful features that we might need in our application. So I want to look at things like relationships and also some of the additional query functions. So let's turn our attention back. Let's get rid of that, and let's look at our book and our author class. So these are the classes we've had in here in this system from the beginning, and you'll notice that these relationships here are, that one isn't, that's one that I've added, so ignore that for now. Let's comment that one out. This one here is added automatically by Yi when we generate this class. So what happens is the Yi looks at the table in here, and what was I looking at? Book. Looks at the book table, it looks at the relational view and says, this author ID column happens to point to the author table. And what the Yi does is it takes that and it creates this relationship. And what effectively that gives us is we can call it as a function or a property. We'll talk about that in a minute. But what that says is my book now has an author, but rather than pulling all of the data and copying it into this model, what it does instead is using this function has1, is it points to the author class instead, and it says that the author ID in my book relates to the ID field of my author class. So when I call this author or get author, it's going to automatically grab me an author from the database, populate a model, and will return that for me to use. And likewise, unsurprisingly, is we have a relationship in the other direction. And what happens here, again, we'll ignore that bit for a minute. Let's comment that one out as well. If we see here, we have a different direction. We have, in the case of a book has one author. Now, obviously in real life, a book could have more authors, but in our application, it only has one. But in our system, and one author can write many books. So whereas in book we has one author, an author has many books. But other than that, it works in a similar way. We say that the ID in book matches our author ID. And what that'll do is that, again, will glue it up automatically. So again, if I want to call books and I want to say, well, I've got an author and I want to find the books, then all I do is I call this function, and this will all just magically work. In fact, I'm not sure if this is the right way around. I think it might not be the right way around, but anyway, we'll ignore that for now. So one of the things that's worth noting at this point is I want to just show you a little example of some code. So kind of ignore all this bit for a second, because that's the stuff that was already in there. All I've done is I've put some code in here just as somewhere to put it, just to demonstrate something. It's not too important. It's not anything really to do with this this action. But let's have a look at what we're doing here. With ActiveRecord, one of the things that we can do very easily is we call this function find. And we'll be using this a lot, because find is the beginning of any queries that we want to do. There are a couple of shortcut functions. There's one called find one and there's one called find all. And they allow us to find items by primary key. So if the only thing we care about is a primary key, we could say $book equals book, : find one, and we could just say the number is 101 or whatever, and that would also work. But for more general queries, we start with the find function. In this case, I'm picking a specific book, which is Paradise Lost, and I'm doing that with a where clause. And then because these build up a query, in order to actually get the model out of the end of the query, I have to call this function at the end. In this case, I know there's only going to be one, so I'm going to call one. If there were going to be more of them, I would call all instead, all like that. But oops, but I've only got one, so I'm going to call one. Now, what I want you to note here is I've now found a book, Paradise Lost, and that Paradise Lost has an author. In the case of our system, Paradise Lost was written by John Milton. So let's have a little look at what's going to happen here. Book 2 equals this book, and then I want to find the author of that book, which is John Milton. And of course that author points back to the books that he's written. In this case, this author has only written one book, and I'm going to get the item right at the beginning. So I'm going to get his first book, which should match this book. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. I've started with a book. I've gone from the book using this relationship to the author, and then once I've got my author, I've then used this to get the books coming out the other end. And if I look at this, I want to then say, are these two books equal? Now obviously they should be, because all I've done is gone from the book to the author back to the book again. So what I'm going to do, just to save some time, let's get rid of all of that. I'm going to just log that to the application login here. So if I just pop back to the site and go to books. Oh, what have I done? Unknown property, broken it already. That's a bit strange, isn't it? Unknown property, I'll look at that in a second. But if you look here, what it's done is it's, where do we go? Right, select star from book, so it's found a book. It's then called another select statement to get the author. But then when I've gone to this part and said I want the books for that author, what it's actually done is gone back to the database again and said I want all the books where this author ID equals 1. Even though that book at position 0 is the same as that book, it's actually called two different SQL select statements for those books, one up there and one up there. This bit is then just a bit after it where I'm just wiring up the page. Let me just fix that problem a second because that's a bit annoying. It's going to distract me. Let's find out what that error was. Refresh the page, and that's going to say the author display name. Oh, sorry, it's because I commented out this function earlier. We are going to mention that later, that's why I commented out, but just check that works. Okay, fine. Right, let's go back again. So, how do we get around that? Well, how do we get around the fact that we're going to load the same thing lots and lots and lots of times? Obviously, in a small system, it's not going to be a problem. You're not really going to notice. But one of the problems that we'll face is on a larger system with lots of books, lots of authors, whatever, then we're going to end up loading the same thing lots of times. So what ye provides, which is very clever, is a little function here called inverse of. So that bit is exactly the same as it was before, and all we've done is we've tagged on the end of it this function called inverse of. Now what that means is when you get into the book class, there will be a property called author which points back to me. And likewise in here, get rid of this, and this does exactly the same thing. Again, I have one author, but when you get the author, the property called books is what points back to me. And what that tells you to do is not to reload things lots and lots of times, but to reuse the objects that are already there. So if I go back and run this again with any luck, I go here and it now tells me that the objects are equal. So if we look down here, ignoring this description, we can actually cache this stuff using the database connection string. But notice now there are only two selects. So I've selected that book where the title is Paradise Lost. I've then got the author for it. But notice that when I then select this book 0, it hasn't gone to the database again because it's worked out that this link is two directional, and it's worked out that it has already loaded the book that I want, and it's reused that. And it's very clever because it saved a trip to the database, and it means that those two things are actually pointing to the same object in memory. So we've reduced memory, we've reduced trips to the database. So that's quite interesting, and that's something that it's just good practice to get into. Notice that ye doesn't automatically add these. It adds a relation. It will add that bit automatically if you've set the foreign key in the database. What it hasn't done is it hasn't added the inverse bit automatically. Like I say, tag that on the end, and then that saves memory. It's just a little trick there. It's one of those things you might as well do. There's no harm in doing it, and if you get used to doing that all the time, then you're all going to be really good. So let me just look down what we need to cover next. The thing with these ActiveRecord classes as well, if for instance you forgot to put in a foreign key, or maybe when you generated the model, everything was here, but then afterwards you went back in, picked a table, whatever, went to structure, added a new foreign key somewhere, and that's missing in your code. In these active records, because they are code classes, you can just add them in again, and that could be whatever, your items, I don't know, whatever it might be. You can just type that in, and again, that will all work automatically without you having to do anything else. So there's no extra magic code that gets generated. All of this just works because the Ye framework handles it for you. So if you forget stuff, you can just add them in afterwards. Okay, so that is mostly the stuff to do with relationships. Now, what you might or might not know about PHP and the newer versions of PHP is you have these magic properties. Now, what that means is if I want to access, let's go back to our book controller. Let's just put that stuff back in. Notice here that I use arrow books like it's a property, and use arrow author like it's a property. But let's go back to book and notice that there is no author property. There's an author ID and there's get author. But what the magic properties do is they say, if I can't find a property called author, then I'm going to call getAuthor instead. And this does something quite clever, because what happens under the covers here is you are allowed to access this either as a property like that, but we could also do $author equals $book1 arrow, and we could do getAuthor. And that works as well. The only difference between those two, or it's quite a big difference, is the property, number one, it is cached. So if you access that multiple times, even if the database has changed, you will get the same data unless you delete the cache, and you do that calling unbind, and then you access it again. So you could do basically pop, you could do unbind, I can't remember where the function's declared, but that might work, and then if you called it again, then that data would be reread again from the database. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, what you get returned from the property is actually an author model. So you're getting an instance of one of these, and that means you can call all of these properties directly on that author class, on the instance. However, if you call the function version, you don't get a book, sorry, in this case an author, you don't get an author back. What you get is you get a query interface. So you get something a bit more like find. So you could say book one, I mean it doesn't really work with author. Let's say let's just change this a little bit and do, it makes more sense when you've got lots of them to select from. So if we did get books, then what we have the ability to do here is call all of these things like where, limit, all those kinds of things. Because books is not returning an array of books, it's going to return a query interface. Whereas books, the property, will return back the actual collection of book objects. So a little subtle difference there to be aware of. You will probably find out fairly easily if you get it wrong, because you'll probably get an error if you try and do stuff. But that's why you're getting the error. Remember, they're very subtly different. The other thing is getAuthor as a query interface will not cache anything, because effectively you're getting a query object and you're going to query the database. So that's something that you need to know about. Right. So we've already probably seen lots of these things in use. We've seen, if we look at book, let's look at book view here. We will see a use of a relationship. So if you look here, this is in a book view, but when we're detailing this, let's go and have a look at what this actually looks like, so we're not confusing. You'll notice that we put the author in here. Now this is the author's name, and we don't store the author's name in the book model. What we store is a relationship to an author, and that author has a name. So what we've done here is author, again, is this automatic property that exists on our model. And because it's an automatic property, we can then treat it just like it's an author instance, and we can call its display name. And in this case, in the widget, we tell it it's type text, and we want the label to be author. But this display name is what we might call a derived property, or a property. I can't remember, a data transformation function. And what that does is, let's go and look at author and see where that function is. And again, it's a simple function. There's nothing magic in here at all. The only thing that's important is if we put that get on the front of it, and we have to put that there, then that becomes an automatic property. Notice also that that first letter gets made into a small letter normally when it's used. So it would normally look like that if you're using it as a property. But we have get display name. It's just a function, and in our case all I do is I'm going to say I want the first name, a space, and a surname. nothing magic, nothing clever. It's just a convenience function, a way of transforming the data. But what it means is, rather than here having to write first name, last name, blah blah blah, which in some cases might be easy enough to do, but in the case of a widget is more difficult, then all I need to do is call this display name instead. It will call this function, and this function will glue it together. Now if I also wanted to be able to set that, that would be no problem at all. Again, I'd have that, I'd have my new value coming in here, and I would do whatever I do, you know, maybe chop up this value into two, put one in here, whatever that might be. But again, that will work automatically because I've used that little magic word set on the front of it. And anywhere where I can call display name equals, that's any kind of form or whatever, then that would work as well. So that's kind of data transformation. There's a couple of different tricks that you can do as well. So when we're querying all of this stuff, let's have a look at another example. Let's just get rid of that now. Let's go back to our site controller. So if you remember in the last video, if you watched the last video, you notice on the front page, I basically, let's log out a second. I put here basically a list of top books, and I did it using DAO, and I did it using Query Builder. But it's slightly different with the ActiveRecord. It's basically the same idea. We set a query, and we call, in this case, book find, and I want to order by rank. Now the only thing that's a bit different, and I'm not sure why they've done it because it's a bit annoying, is if I put this on there, it doesn't work. Okay, and the reason it doesn't work is because in the list view basically says the pagination values are what is going to determine my limit. So that's how many I'm going to call. It doesn't use the limit that you specify in the query, it uses the pagination. So as you can see, it looks different because it's given me pages, because that page size is really just saying I only want 3 on the front page, and if I click there I'm going to get the second 2. That's not really what I wanted to do, but that's a problem with the list view, and I'm not going to spend any time trying to fix that. But if you look, it kind of works in the same way. The difference is, rather than starting with a query, we're starting with a model, in this case book, and we find our function again, find, which is the start of a query. And in this case I could obviously use the select the columns I wanted. I can do all kinds of stuff, but in this case all I'm doing is ordering by rank, and in this case that will return all the records, and then as I said, I'm using the page size to change that around. Notice this is an active data provider, it's not the array data provider we did last time. But there is actually a trick that we can use. I'm hoping it's going to work because I haven't tried this. Let's go back to here and change it back to an array. And if I just bring back in, oh, is that what I wanted to do? I can bring back in the stuff that I typed in here before, because it will save me getting it wrong. Come on, come on, come on, come on, come on, come on. Oh, it's going to take ages. Right, let me try. Okay, so I'm going to change this to an array data provider instead. I think I've still got that included. Yep. And in this case, rather than setting the query, the array data provider, if I remember rightly, which I can't, I think uses something called all models or something like that. All models, yep. So we're going to do this. And we're going to do something similar, so we're still going to use the ActiveRecord, so we wouldn't normally need to do this, but I'm going to try something, because one of the things that you can do here is you can say that you want it as an array. Okay, now why would you do this? Well, effectively by starting with the ActiveRecord, we're kind of saying that we want ActiveRecord classes returned. But sometimes if you've got lots and lots and lots of them, which there obviously aren't here, but if you did have lots and lots of them, then each of those models is going to take up a lot of memory, and that might be slow. It might eat all the memory up on your server. So what you can do is you can type in as array, and instead of returning models, it will return you an array. So instead of a model, each entry in the array will just be something that looks like basically JSON code. It will be name value pairs for all of the properties in that model, and that's basically a quicker way of doing what we need to do. Now if this has worked correctly, which it may or may not do, no, of course it didn't, then sorry, I haven't got the error turned on. Let's put that back to error, empty that out. It might be something easy to fix, might not. Exception with message, array slice, expects parameter 1 to be an array, and I've been given an object. So, oh, I know why that is. It's because, where's my controller gone? It's because if I go back to here, I have to call all on the end of it, although I'm not sure if that's quite right. PHP arrays, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, I don't know exactly how to do that. I should have tried that before. Very sorry. But as array, like I say, it's kind of supposed to save you some time. It returns less data. One of the things that I did notice actually when using the active data provider is that it does treat things a little bit differently. So whereas normally at the end of something like this you would have an all function which would return all of the rows as a type book, in these active data providers you don't usually add that on the end of it. If you do, then you're effectively trying to fill that with data, and it doesn't want data, it wants a query. I mean, in this case it might work, but who knows. Oh, there you go, it does. So okay, in the case of the array I do need to call all to get all of the items back because it is all that runs a query. In the case of the active data provider, you don't call all because you're giving it a query, not a set of data, and then the active data provider will run the query for you and unpack it for you. So that's obviously the difference. So you can see ultimately it's not going to make any difference. It's just that the data comes back as an array. It's a bit quicker. You may or may not care about that. I also mentioned before, I'm not going to go into it again, about reading batch stuff, and the let me just get rid of all this stuff. Oh no, I can leave that there, can't I? Batching queries. So again, you can do the same thing just like you can in Query Builder. You can actually call stuff by batch. Again, it's just let's write it somewhere else. We could do, well, just do it here. So we could call book. We could get all of them, say find all, where, I don't know, whatever, and we could say batch, and again that gives us a batch of stuff. Each time we call batch, it's going to give us some more, and then we can do that in in groups just to save paging. So again, if you're interested in that, by the time you're dealing with that much data, hopefully you're going to be a bit more familiar with this stuff. You'll be familiar with the docs. You'll be able to find the stuff in the guide much more easily. So that's batch data. Just a couple more things, I guess, or quite a few more things. There are a couple of helper functions. So I want to show you an example of update all. So again, you can build up these queries individually. So you could say, book : find blah blah blah, update blah blah blah, and you could also do it using DAO or Query Builder as well. But because this is the kind of thing you might want to do, they provide there's an update all and there's a delete all. It's a bit misleading because you can actually add a condition if you want, so you don't have to actually update them all. If we go back to the definition of it, the default one, obviously you need to tell it what to update, but you can also give it a condition, say only update if such and such is true. So for instance, in this case I've said, well, I want to update the rank in the database, so let's just make sure we can still see that, and it hasn't logged me out yet. Okay, so if we look at the rank, look at the lowest one, for instance, you see it's 544. So if I run this code by going into the book index thing, which is there, Okay, again, I only put the code there because it's easier than writing a whole new page. So if I now query this again, you'll notice that all of those numbers have gone up by 1. So all I've done is I've called update all and I said rank. Now here's a little tip. If you're doing something complicated, then you can use this class YDB expression, and then effectively you just put some text in there, and that text will get put into the SQL automatically. So there's probably an easier way to do this, adding one to a column, but you could do expression, and that could be all kinds of stuff. It could be get date, it could be UTC timestamp, whatever you might need to do. Expression doesn't always work. I tried it in one example, and I think I was trying to use it for a default when I was creating a table, and that didn't work, but that works. That's update all. As you imagine, delete all, very, very similar kind of idea, but I'm obviously not going to run that, otherwise it will break. ActiveRecord supports transactions, but again, not really anything specifically to do with ActiveRecord. Transactions are just transactions. You can find about them on the guide. If we look here, these are, again, more kind of advanced stuff, but if you look here, it calls customer get DB, but I don't really know why it's bothered doing that. You got track transactions, so you can do it in a couple of different ways. You can either do it using a functor, which is like a function pointer, or you can call begin transaction, do some stuff, and then commit the transaction if it all works, or roll it back. Again, nothing really magic there. If you're new to this, then don't worry too much about transactions for now. If you do know about transactions, then you can go and find it in the documentation. That's all fairly easily. And another thing I wanted to show was something that's quite nice that Yi has helped us out with, and that is something called a many-to-many relationship. So let's just close some of these and make it look a little bit less scary. Okay, that's that. User. Right. So imagine that when we log into our system, where's our system gone? When we log into our system, that we can buy books, let's say. And every time I buy a book, it's going to record the fact that I've bought a book. So I've created a new table in here, and it has a book ID and a user ID. So user ID 4 has bought book 2, and user ID 4 has also bought book 3. And let's just have a quick look. User ID 4 is username Luke2, which is obviously my second login. And obviously the book ID points to books 2 and 3. 2 and 3 happens to be Paradise Lost and Frankenstein, but it's just for an example. So that's just a simple table. Now the important thing to note is that that produces a special relationship between user and book via this table. So we would say that user now has many books, and remember, many doesn't mean that every user has many books. It means that every user can have 1 or 0 sometimes, or more books. But likewise, book now points to many users via the same table. So a book can be bought by many users, and a user can have bought many books, a many-to-many relationship. Usually that's handled by this type of table. Call it a link table, sometimes called a junction table. But Yi's very clever at how it deals with these. So let's go and have a look at what I've done in code. In our models, let's get rid of that a second. In our models, notice I've created a new model called, not that one, that one, called book user link. Book user link has 2 relationships. It has 1 user and it has 1 book. That's all pretty normal, nothing magic there. That's all automatically generated code. Now we will never use this table directly. We will probably, add links some other way. So let's just mostly ignore that for now. But the important thing then is, what do we do in book? Because my book now has many users. And so there's 2 different ways that we can define that, or 2 different styles. The first of which says, first bit looks normal. It says that I have many users. So we've told it what the target class is called. Remember, I'm in book here. So my book has users, And what I'm pointing to here is I'm saying there's a user ID in another table, as it happens, that points to the ID of the user. Question is, where does that user ID come from? Because I have many of them, so that means that this is not a property of book. And that's where via table comes in, because via table says you won't find that property in book, you will find it in book user link. So of course the question is, well, how do I join onto that book user link table? And the answer is my ID, that is the ID of book, will match a book ID in this via table. Okay, it's a little bit, it looks a bit confusing because that ID is the book ID, that ID is the ID from the user model, and then the user ID and the book ID are both columns in that table there. Once you've done it a couple of times, you get used to it. But this now gives us a users relationship. So I can call my book.users, and even though that goes via another table, that will still appear to me like a collection of users and not like a collection of book user links. So that's one way in which we can do that. The other way, which I'm going to show you in the opposite direction, these are both exactly the same, but you can do it either way. Sorry, I'm in the wrong model. Go to user. Let's go down the bottom. So what I've done in this case is I've said, rather than doing the via table, I'm actually going to create a relationship which points the user to this book user link table. And this is more of a normal, I have many, and my ID is the user ID in that table. So that's just a normal relationship. Whether or not I want that or not, I might never use that. But the beauty of having this relationship specified as user books is it now means when I specify my books relationship, which remember was kind of the opposite flavor of that one, is the syntax is much cleaner, because I can say my user has many books, and the book ID from that relationship matches the ID of the book. And you've defined that relationship up there, again using magic property syntax. So my user has many books, the book ID in the via matches the ID in the book, and all of that is encapsulated in a separate piece of code. So slightly more code, but it's separated out, so maybe that's slightly cleaner to read. They both do exactly the same thing, so it's up to you whether you want to use this style or that style. So that's fine. Now what can we do with that? Well, I've modified my index again, and I want to say, okay, if I'm logged in, so if the user isn't a guest, then I'm going to show recent orders. Now hopefully it's going to work. So what it does is it just echoes out a heading if the user's logged in, and in this case, rather than building this in the controller, which is where it should be really, what I've done is I've just built it in the view just because it's quick and easy. And what I've done is I've got the user. Now notice this is the web user, not my user model, so I have to call identity, and identity will get me the user model. And then once I've got the user model, I can call get books. Now remember, this wants a query, so I don't want to call books, which would not be a query. I need to call get books. I'm going to pass that into my active data provider, and then what I'm going to do here is, I'll save all of that, is all I've done is join that data provider into the list view widget, use the same view that I use on the left hand side to display those things. So let's now go back to here. Now I'm not logged in at the minute, so you'll see there's a big gap in the middle here. So if I now log in, and I log in as Luke2, I type in my password, log in, what will happen now is your recent orders, and it showed me those 2 books. So very little code here. All I've done is told it to get the books related to that user, and at the bottom of user, that's automatically used that junction table and got me the books on the other end of the junction. and I haven't had to do anything clever to do that. I didn't have to say, you know, get book user links, get books, or anything random like that. All I've done is called that as a relationship, and that's worked automatically. And that's one thing that you'll do a lot in ActiveRecord, is you can create all kinds of relationships. The other thing that you'll do quite a lot is potentially factory methods. So you might say, where are we in book? You might say get most popular book. You could do something like that. And again, what you would do here is you could do return. This is static, so I have to call static find by condition. We'll find one, something like that, and then in the condition I could say, you know, I don't know, whatever, where book is, where the rank is higher than 10,000 or something or other like that. So again, you do lots of those, and what that means that you can do again is in views you can just say, not that view, where was the other view? It was that one. You know, so again we could pass in things like, you know, book, get most popular book, you know, and again what we've done there is we've moved all of the functionality of what's going on back down into the model, and we're going to return it in there. Or actually, we'd probably just do. Well, no, in this case we'd have to do get most popular book. If we were using it in a widget, we would have to get the object itself. So again, we would call most popular book as a property, and that would get out the stuff that way instead. So that's all really cool. I guess I'll mention quickly a few things. The data that you load as a relationship, I'm going to have to undo all of this because this is going to break otherwise. Okay, that will do. Doesn't like that, it's fine, let's get rid of that. When you have these related properties, let's say you have a book and a book has authors. The authors are not loaded when you load the book. They are loaded when you access the author property of the book. So let's see if we've got one of these still there. So for instance, book find, order by rank, right, so we've got that and we've grabbed the books. Now supposing, let's grab that out a second and put it into here, $books equals that. Right, so I've grabbed a collection of books, which is not particularly interesting, but let's just actually find, let's find one, and let's find one, let's just do that. I don't need it all on the end now because that's a handy function, so I think that will work. So what that's going to do is going to find me a random book. That's fine. So what happens now is if I then say authors equals $, let's change that to books, that makes a bit more sense, equals $book authors, not brackets. What will happen here is when I first call that, there'll be one SQL statement that will say, you know, select star from book where ID equals 2. I think that's what it will do. That's what it should do. When I then call book authors, it will then send a second SQL statement saying select star from authors where, you know, book ID equals 2, or, you know, however it builds up the SQL. But it's going to do that in 2 stages. That's what we call lazy loading. Lazy loading is usually a good idea because what it means is if you're not going to use that information, then you're not going to load it. The problem sometimes happens is that, let's say you find a book and you edit it, and as soon as you then open the page to check on the authors, it then runs off to the database and does a big query, and it's, you know, it's really slow and you don't want to do it like that. So what you can actually do is you can use this function with, I don't know if you can apply it to the end of this or not. It's normally used in find, so let's start with find where let's put not that, ID is 2, but here we do with, and we can specify that we want the authors, and this is a relationship name, to come with it. And then because we're only expecting one, we can do that at the end of it. So if you used a query, this with function says that I want you to load all of that when you load the book. And what that will do is that will combine all of that SQL into a single statement, so that rather than making 2 trips to the database, it only makes one. And obviously when you then access this, it doesn't do anything else because it's already loaded it. So that's how you do eager loading. You can do with. You can also join with other things as well. So again, you can join tables in here. You could join, you know, and again tell you what type, what table. So you can do inner join with as well if you want to do inner join. And what this enables you to do, especially when you're actually doing queries of pieces of information like count how many users have books or those kinds of things, then joining is all quite handy. Again, all of the instructions are in here. Sorry, not in here, in the guide. So please go to the guide. And yeah, one other thing that's I guess worth noticing just as I finish the video is that you're also able to link things together. So imagine in a case of our book and our user, we created let's say a new book. So we do new book and we set something like $book arrow title equals new book, and we want to associate that with the current user. Obviously you could do all kinds of stuff, like you could go, you know, bearing in mind that there's a link table, a junction table here, you could either insert a new item into that junction table and say, right, I need to save the book, get its ID, put the ID in the junction table with the current user's ID, can save that. I could then find the current user, find the books collection of the current user, update that, blah 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 blah. But actually this will all do it for you, which is quite handy. And again, it's all part of ActiveRecord. So if I do this and I want to link that with the user, now watch out for this because I need to explain there is a catch in a second. But what I can do is I can say, I can't remember the exact syntax for this, but I'll call link, establish a relationship between 2 models. And I'm going to do, the name is going to be, so this will be the relationship, I think. So this will be books, and the model will be, in this case, it will be the current user. So it would be ye app user identity. I'm not sure if that will work automatically. So all that you do there is you say, right, I want to link which, hang on a sec, let me just make sure I've got that the right way around. The case sensitive name of the relationship, so that will actually be users, won't it? So I do the link and I say, right, I want to link my book users into the current user. And what that will do is it will do all the linking, it will save and update everything, which is all great. The only thing you have to be really careful for is if you are using a junction table, which this is, then you must call save before you do the link. If you don't do that, it will fall over. If you don't have a junction table, so if you had something like more like an author, and let's say you wanted to link this into an author instead, and then you used, you know, author, you know, whatever, find one, you know, something or other. If you want to do it that way, that would work fine, because there's no junction table for this. And what that will do is it'll link it all up and it will save both of them automatically. So again, you can link it. That's a nice quick way of creating the relationships between them, and that's when you're creating a new object like we are in this case. You can obviously also unlink things as well. I'm not going to cover that again. You can find the books if you need to. So that's kind of the end of what I want to say for this video. Hopefully you've kind of got the idea that it is really a lot of the same stuff. I mean, there are almost a million different examples I could give you that all be slightly different, but really the active query, most of it starts from that idea of, if I've still got one here, of calling find, and then the bit after that is very, very similar to query builder stuff. Stuff that you've all seen before. It's just lots of build a pattern, building the stuff all together like that, and then calling something at the end to make that all happen. So whether it's count or whether it's all or one, or get column or whatever it might be. So that's really most of that stuff. We've looked at a lot of the relationships and how it's good to use inverse of to save memory, to make sure that you can identify the directions of these relationships. And also we've seen has many, including junction table stuff as well. And then we've seen just a few examples of how we actually render those things in the case of an active data provider. Remember that if it's active, then we need to provide it with an active query interface and not the actual models. Whereas if we use the array provider, then we need to actually call all, and that will turn it into, well, if we call as array all, that will turn it into data. Otherwise, we could do something similar with the query as well. But hopefully that kind of gives you enough of a flavor to get on with stuff. I'm sure you're going to have lots of questions. Please ask them in the comments. I might or might not be able to answer them. But hopefully that gives you enough of a kind of a flavour and a confidence just to kind of get on. And I guess one thing I didn't really mention is most of this functionality should really be in the controller. So if you've got factory methods, get author, get users, relationships, things like, I don't know how many of these have actually got any in them. Where are the models gone? So get books, the factory methods I told you about, like, get best book, get, newest book, whatever, all of those kind of factory methods. Well, that's fine. They can go in here because the logic is very straightforward. But when you're talking about what to glue, where and how and why, and building up queries and doing complicated stuff and doing all these kinds of things, then really that belongs in the controller because it's going to be very specific, probably to an action. And then you can throw that stuff in there as well. But hopefully that should answer enough of your questions to get on with, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video.